Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for today's short presentation on Research Today, Policy Tomorrow. My name is Sally Hardy and I'm the General Manager of RSA Europe. So let's kick off. On this slide, I've identified just a few of the problems that we're facing in today's world. These are problems that manifest at very different scales and affect people's lives in very different ways. And what we're talking about today is the way in which researchers can help policymakers come to effective solutions and ways to take us forward. So how does this relationship work? Well, I'm maintaining here that it's messy. The problems are wicked, so no single answer is going to cure every aspect of it, and sometimes answers themselves raise additional problems. There are challenges for politicians and researchers. For example, there is policy skepticism sometimes of research results, and a good example of that is in climate change. There can be policy reluctance to engage with the results, even when the data is collected by government agencies. And I think we all saw that during the COVID-19 crisis. There can be problematic research results where there are alternative explanations for the phenomena, leading to confusion in which is the right route out. And we saw that in the UK during the debates and discussions around Brexit. This relationship between the research and the policy has never been more important, and nor has it been more tricky. So the question is, can we help make this situation better? And as the General Manager of RSA Europe, which is an academic foundation, obviously, I think yes. So what are the blockers and enablers to try and make better connections? Let's start by looking at the scale of the resource. In 2020, in the UK alone, there were 223,000 academics. Now, not all of those are in policy-facing fields, but even if you assume that 25% are, that's an enormous resource. So how do the policymakers connect with that resource? Well, a survey was done, and it said that 79% connected through research reports. Over 60% connected via newspapers, and over 50% directly via academic journals. Many people also used conferences, both academic and policy conferences, but where the research is presented. And policymakers are usually pointed to these resources via social media. And what is the kind of research that policymakers like to read? Interestingly, 77% of the respondents liked case studies, and one can see why, because you can see how that might apply in your particular situation. 76% liked quantitative analysis, 70% liked qualitative analysis, and I think it's very interesting that those numbers are so even. There is clearly an understanding that we need a heterogeneous approach to answering wicked problems. Interestingly, comparative analysis scored slightly lower at 60%, which is interesting because it can often throw up really new conclusions if you compare two different places in the way in which they respond to a single problem. Most researchers, most policymakers accept that research underlies their work. 36% said they used research a few times a month, and the same number said they used it a few times a year. So how do we make these connections work more smoothly and more frequently? Well, there are responsibilities on both sides. So I'm going to start here by focusing on the role of policymakers in making this work. So the first thing to do is to understand and set out the principles for engagement when you start working with a researcher. Understand that even though researchers are often paid for by the public purse, they are not paid to help you. Research career paths are still based on research and publications, not on policy engagement. It doesn't necessarily help a researcher, particularly an early career researcher, to run around providing information to policymakers that will almost certainly not be attributed to them. Secondly, be generous-spirited. The researcher is doing you a favour providing the information that you've asked for. If they ask you to support them in a project that they're engaged with, say yes if you can. So if they need a grant support letter when they're applying for funding, write the grant support letter for them. Don't rely on the normal suspects. This is an approach that's poor for diversity. You don't hear new views and you won't hear alternative views that may in fact resonate better for the problem that you're interested in. In research in 2019, it was shown that 85% of the independent policy advisors to the UK government were male. 98% of those were white, and almost all of them lived in London. Embrace all diversities, not just gender. Geography also really matters. Try to invest in new networks. So attending events like the EU Regions Week or some of the large association conferences are a good example of how to do this, especially if those events are face-to-face and you have the coffee queue moments. If you can, consider doing sponsored internships where a member of your staff team would work in a university and vice versa. That's a great way of helping both sides to understand the problems and challenges that are faced in making these relationships work. Get interested and get involved in co-production. So co-production is where a research grant would be put in, and it would include the policymaker at the beginning. So writing the grant proposal, being involved in the research as it's being carried out, and certainly being involved in the write-up and the dissemination and the implementation of any policy conclusions that come from that research. Quite often what happens is policymakers are involved at the beginning, but then drift away. Now, sometimes that's because they change jobs, but if you can, do stay involved. It might not be very important for you, but it's absolutely critical for the researcher. Consider digital engagement. We now have enormous familiarity with mediums like Zoom, with networking software like GatherTown or Hivebright or Shaper. How can using those technologies help you put together small groups or focus groups to talk to you when you've got a problem? Be aware, finally, of the difference between research and expertise. Generalists can be very useful for policymakers. And as Spike Milligan once said, a lot of learning can be a little thing. So now I'm going to move on to how researchers can improve their chances and success rates in their policy engagement. And the first thing I would say is, if you can, take policy training. Knowledge mobilization, knowledge exchange is not easy and it's not linear. As we said before, it's messy, but you can learn from formal training. The second is to make yourself visible. So have a website, make sure that it's appropriately meta tagged, and be consistent in the research channels that you use. So if you always use LinkedIn to put your research results out, continue to use LinkedIn, but you may want to consider using Twitter as well. Make your work visible. So use open access to publish your work if you can. If you can't, make sure that you use your institutional repository or your publisher's repository. And when you send out links, include a link to Unpaywall, which is an app which helps readers to find non-paywalled access to the work that you're publishing. This will not be the publisher's final version with all of the live links. It will not have all the additional value that the publishers add, but it will be the immediate Word version prior to going into the publishing system. Use your e-signature to list your recent reports and work, your recent articles. So at the bottom of your email, when you email someone, they can see what you're working on. And that can be a great way of flagging up your current research interests. And finally, and very obviously, use social media to promote your work, particularly Twitter. But obviously, if you're promoting work into China, Twitter doesn't work. You'd need to consider WeChat. Make sure that you target policymakers at opportune times, and I suggest those times are when you've got new research results to share. You also need to negotiate your engagements with policymakers. So if in return for providing information to policymakers that's outside a research grant, then ask them, will you support my next research grant application with a letter, or whatever it is, speak at a conference, whatever it is that would help you. Helps to build the relationship. And again, when you consider putting in grant funding, consider co-production. Then in this section, I'm going to just talk about, for both researchers and policymakers, both need to understand the disconnects between research and policy. So it's likely that data is different for both of you. For researchers, it's carefully collected, analysed and explained. But for policymakers, material from secondary sources, from reliable secondary sources, might be good enough. What policy advice looks and sounds like might be different. Researchers can be too high level and general. Policymakers are often grounded in the pragmatic and the immediate, often smaller scale and requiring quite nuanced decisions. So talk in advance about what's required. Timescales are different for both researchers and policymakers. A quick report for a researcher might take a month, but a policymaker might need something by 2 o'clock this afternoon. So that is a challenge. And for both sides, if you promise to do something, it's really important that you do it. These relationships often have a 1 or 2 strikes and you're out. And my advice finally would be to stay in touch and nurture the relationships and continue to work on them. I would also direct you to some of the organisations that sit at the interstices between research and policy. So on this slide, we have the Regional Studies Association, the Association of European Schools of Planning, the European Regional Science Association, and RSA Europe. All of these sit between policymakers and researchers and can help you to build your networks. So I do hope that you will take a look at the societies, see if membership's for you, maybe give it a try for a year. And that's it for my whistle-stop tour of how to improve the relationships between policymakers and researchers. I hope that that's been helpful, and I hope that you will look at the Regional Studies Association's Professional Development Series, where we provide a lot of other webinars that you might be able to draw on. Thanks very much indeed, and goodbye.